Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice little 5-game slate for the main slate that starts at 6:40 Eastern. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Really does help the channel a lot. Also, shout out to Bruce Gant for picking Otani for a home run call, and also Inglorious Bradsterd for the call of Goldschmidt. Make sure to drop your comments below with your home run calls today, and I'll shout you out in the next video. With that said, guys, let's get started here. Let's go ahead and get our core plays first, and we're going to look at DraftKings here at McCann, LeMahieu, and Nemo. And then for the FanDuel, we're going to look at LeMahieu, Correa, and Nemo, and Marte. So let's go ahead and get into this slate, though. So first here on DraftKings, we'll look at pitchers, and we have several good options to choose from today, with Shane McClanahan being one of the better ones, facing the Chicago White Sox today, and a pretty good matchup. He's the obvious pay-up option here. He's been over 20 fantasy points in all 5 starts he's had this season, including 4 wins. He had 10 strikeouts versus Chicago White Sox last time he started, which was the last game. However, it is sometimes difficult to repeat that kind of success. He still has 20-plus fantasy point upside in this matchup. He also has a pretty good K rate. His worst game this season, he's had 6 strikeouts, and that gives him some nice upside as a result. Then we'll look at Garrett Cole. Now, Garrett Cole has been all over the place fantasy-wise to start the season. He's had some really big-time games, and then he's had average games. This is not the most ideal matchup he's ever had by any stretch of imagination. Actually, second toughest team he's faced this year. But he's a good contrarian option to McClanahan as a P1 option. But he's high risk, high reward. His strikeout rate does give him a lot of upside. His price is not ideal, though, on this particular slate. Then we'll look at our P2 options here, and we're going to start with Tyler Mahle from Minnesota at $8,000. He's in a pretty decent spot here. He's been a little bit wonky to start the year, but he's got a great matchup here against Kansas City, a team that does not do very well to start off this year, one of the easiest teams he's faced, and he has really good upside for this matchup. And in the 2 games against weaker opponents, against Washington and Miami, he did pretty solidly, and then the 2 games against tough teams, the Yankees and the Houston, he didn't do quite as well. The K rate is not ideal, but he definitely has some upside anyhow, so he's definitely in play here. Kyle Gibson for Baltimore is also in an interesting spot here. He's got some really big upside in this matchup, but he's also been up and down throughout the start of the season. He did manage 11 strikeouts in this last game, which was also against Detroit, but this is high risk, high reward because he's typically not that good of a K rate guy, and so, but his price is cheap enough that he's definitely viable here, but he's high risk, high reward, and obviously Detroit doesn't have a lot to throw at you. Then we'll look at Joey Lasucci for the Mets. Now, he is kind of a Hail Mary option, but he's so cheap here that he's worth a consideration because he's only had 1 start in the last 2 years, and that was last start against San Francisco, but he had a really solid game, and his K rate was good. His price is cheap enough that he's definitely in a viable place here, but he is high risk, high reward. But if you want to pay up for some big, expensive bats on the slate like Judge or Alonso, then he's definitely a way to do that. So, obviously high risk, high reward, but he is cheap enough that he's viable. Let's move into our catchers, and James McCann from Baltimore is our first option. Now, he's very cheap here, and if he draws a start, he's definitely going to be in play. He has good potential. He hasn't hit the ball well to start the year, but he's only started a couple games, so we'll have to wait and see if he continues to DH. And if he can, and sometimes even draws the catcher, he should be a good option on this slate, assuming he does draw that start, which it looks like he might today. And then a good alternative to him is Francisco Alvarez. If he draws a start, he's got home run potential. He's only started a couple games this year as well, similar to McCann, but he's got just as much upside, and he's been hitting the ball about the same as McCann has at this point. But they're kind of home run potential options, and there's really just not much in good situations today at this position. Kansas City's got a tough matchup, and Texas has a tough matchup, and even Baltimore has a little bit of a tough matchup when it comes to the catching perspective. So obviously we'll have to wait and see if there's any other guys that get into the lineups that we didn't anticipate, but overall I look at those 2, McCann and Alvarez, as the best options at this position, though it is Hail Mary-ish like. Pete Alonso comes in at the top play for the Mets. at $6,100. He's very expensive, but he definitely has potential for home runs, though he's had 4 straight games with no hits, and that is a little bit of a concern here, but he is Pete Alonso, and he does manage to hit home runs occasionally, and this is as good a matchup as any, and he's definitely worth consideration here. Dan Vogelbach is a great value play at this position. He's hitting the ball okay, and he's having some decent fantasy point games throughout the season. He also has home run potential in this matchup, and he definitely jumps off the page as a decent option on the slate. Anthony Rizzo for the Yankees also has some nice upside here, and he has been hitting the ball pretty well for the start of the season. He's got home run potential as well, and so he's definitely worth in consideration. Maybe at second base, we're going to start with Gleyber Torres for the Yankees. Now, he is in a pretty good spot here, and he does have home run potential. He's not the best option necessarily due to his price, but he's definitely viable on the slate. Then we'll look at Polanco for Minnesota, who's hitting the ball really well to start the year. And he's just a guy that I really like to roster. He's only played 5 games so far this season, but he's gotten hits in all of them, and he's had 4 over 7 fantasy points, and he's cheap enough that he's definitely worth a look at this position. Another alternative would be Jeff McNeil, who could also play in outfield. He's hitting the ball fairly well, and he's got home run potential in this game, but he isn't as good as the two above him in Torres and Polanco. Then we'll look at DJ LeMahieu at third base. He is the only real good option at third base I could find today. It is a very difficult position on this particular slate, and so I do think he's a great option on this one. He's getting hits in most games, and he's got good he's got good fantasy potential, I should say, simply because he's managing to hit the ball decently well. Then we're going to look at Carlos Correa for Minnesota. And he's got a really interesting matchup here. He hasn't hit the ball particularly well, but he definitely has potential in this matchup, and he's definitely worth consideration here. He also has home run potential. Lindor for the Mets is also an interesting spot, though he is pretty expensive, and he hasn't hit the ball well yet this season. He does have home run potential in this game as well. Washington is going to be a team that the Mets are going to try to crucify today, so I really do like the Mets stacks on this particular slate, and he's definitely somebody you can look at as a good option there. And then we'll look at Anthony Volpe for the Yankees. Now, he's kind of a high-risk, high-reward option, but he is hitting the ball fairly well to start the year, and he's getting stolen bases occasionally. He also has some home run potential, so even though he is kind of up and down, he definitely has some utility in this matchup. Then we'll look in the outfield and look at Aaron Judge for the Yankees. Now, he has high risk, high reward here, being a super high price, but he hasn't hit a home run in several games, and he is kind of due, and he definitely has good potential even if he doesn't hit the home run in this particular matchup. Then we'll look at Byron Buxton for the Minnesota. Now, he's got a good matchup here against Kansas City, but he hasn't hit the ball particularly well yet, but it looks like the last few games he's really starting to get going finally, and if he can continue that, then that's definitely going to be a viable option on the slate. He is a little pricey, but he's definitely rosterable. Then we'll look at Brandon Nimmo, who I do think is a core play. He's a little pricey, but he's just getting on base every game, and that's really what we like, and so he definitely has good potential here. He's had some really solid games. He's averaging 9.2 fantasy points per game to start the year as well. Then we'll look at Josh Lowe for Tampa Bay. Now, he's kind of in a risky situation, but he's hitting the ball so well that he's definitely in consideration at this position. At his price point, he's a good alternative to potentially be a decent play. Jeff McNeil is also in play here at outfield. Again, he's hit the ball fairly well to start the year and has home run potential in this matchup. And then Anthony Santander for Baltimore. He is in a great spot here. He hasn't hit the ball particularly well to start the year, but he has some upside here, and the metrics really do jump in his favor in this particular situation. So with that said, guys, that's what I have for DraftKings. Let's move over here to FanDuel now, and we're going to see a couple pictures here to talk about. First being Shane McClanahan. He is pricey here, but he definitely has big-time upside. He's had 40 fantasy points in all 5 starts to start the year, including 4 wins, and he's had 4 quality starts in those games as well. And he definitely has one of the better strikeout rates on this particular slate. Garrett Cole is also in play, and they're priced very similarly, unlike on DraftKings where Cole's quite a bit more expensive. I do think that they both have utility, but Garrett Cole was still a contrarian option, but he is viable on the slate, and he has big time, 50 fantasy point upside, no matter who he's going against. I'm going to mention a couple other guys. Lasucci at $8,300. He's really not cheap enough to be a super play here on FanDuel because he's priced up so much compared to DraftKings. He's not as ideal on this particular slate, but he does have some potential. Tyler Mal also has some potential in a plus matchup, but again, he's also not priced ideally, and so he's not somebody that I'm really going to try to fit in my lineup. But he definitely has some potential to have a decent game here. And then the same goes for Kyle Gibson, who's just way overpriced for this matchup. Though he does have the potential to have a big, crazy game like he did last time against Detroit. I really don't see that happening again. But I do think he can get in the 30s and 40-point range. And if you just want a super contrarian option to McClanahan or Cole, he would be the way to go about it. With that said, let's get at our catchers and first baseman. Now, obviously, Pete Alonso is fairly expensive over here, and he's been hitting the ball pretty hard this season with a bunch of home runs already. But he has had 4 bad games, but he's in play on this slate, and while his price is high, he is viable and rosterable regardless of which pitcher you use because there's so much value. Then we'll look at Daniel Vogelbach, who's $9,200 is in a really good spot. Or sorry, $2,800. I don't know, it was 9,200. $2,800 is really good spot. He's got some really nice upside in this matchup, and he's definitely a great value play. Anthony Rizzo, also in a really interesting option for this position. He's priced very fairly in this situation, and he's got home run potential here. And then kind of a low-key option is Ryan Mountcastle, who looks kind of sneaky today. If you go with a Baltimore stack, he would definitely be somebody to consider. Moving on to second base, we're going to start with Brandon Lowe, who has some interesting upside in this matchup. Though he's priced pretty high, and he hasn't hit the ball very well the last few games, he still has some nice utility here. Then we'll look at Torres for the Yankees. Now I really like him better than Lowe, simply because he's quite a bit cheaper, and he's got really nice upside for this situation. He's also hit the ball fairly well to start the year. Same goes for Polanco, who I like a lot more than Lowe, especially matchup wise. And Polanco's had a really great start to the season, so I think he's in a really good spot. He's hitting the ball extremely well, and he's one of my favorite plays on the slate. DJ LeMahieu is a great play at third base. He's got some really good upside in this matchup, and his price point is very fair, and that makes him viable. An alternative to him is Yandy Diaz if you want to, do a Tampa Bay stack. Though I don't love the matchup for him, he definitely has the potential to have a good game here anyway. Carlos Correa for shortstop was my favorite play at shortstop, and he is a core play on this particular slate. Yeah, he hasn't hit the ball well, but when he does manage to have a couple, he typically has really good games. He's been hitting decent, really subpar at 200 average, but his price point at 2,800 is just too cheap to ignore here, especially when there's not much available. But a good alternative to him is Volpe. If you wanted to go alternative, he has some nice upside in this matchup, though he's high risk, high reward, and he's the same price as Correa. Moving into the outfield, I'm going to mention Luis Robert Jr. here for Chicago White Sox. Now he has really big time metrics for this matchup, though it is a tough situation. The metrics jump off the page, but I don't love the matchup. But he's definitely worth in consideration. Aaron Judge is obviously fairly expensive, but he has some nice upside in this matchup, and he's actually cheaper than guys like Pete Alonso, so he's definitely in play on FanDuel. Byron Buxton is just way too cheap. He's finally starting to hit the ball well, and as long as he can continue that, then he's definitely going to be in play at these under $3,000 price points. Brandon Nimmo is a core play today for the Mets. He is priced pretty high at $3,400, but he's definitely rosterable on the slate regardless of which pitcher you use with all the other value around. Then we'll look at Starling Marte, who I really like today. He's just too cheap for his potential here. He's a really good spot. He is somewhat high risk, high reward, as he hasn't been super efficient to start the year, but I look for the Mets to be a really good team to stack. Then Jeff McNeil also draws a lot of availability on this particular slate, having some nice upside, and I definitely think he's in play. And then another option is Anthony Santander for Baltimore, who, while he hasn't hit the ball particularly well to start the year, he is managing to score some decent fantasy points in some games, and you don't need him to score a ton at $2,700. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.